today's conversation. We suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. An Aussie-turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome for the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. David, it's great to have you back. You've been gone for a bit.
Thanks, Shelby. Great to be back. Yeah, it's like it's a part of my week. I kind of miss it when I'm not doing it. Yeah.
We're happy to have you here. And our moderator for today leads the research team at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as helps to communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she was a professor at Dominican College and New York University and a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the Senior Director of Research at NLI, Dr. Emma Saro. Thanks for being here today, Emma, as always.
Thanks, Shelby.
I'm passing it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, David, welcome back. It's been a while. We've been struggling through the last few weeks without you.
Oh, I hear it's been great.
Yeah, it's been fun. But yeah, I'm sure everyone here listening and watching are super excited to have you back. And I know that you've been traveling the globe, holding different leadership development mini summits, and hopefully we'll get to some of those ideas and insights that you've had as you've been talking to leaders across the world.
Yeah, it's really interesting doing the same or very similar kind of workshop in many different parts of the world, and it's, sort of one after the other, and you get to see patterns and trends and what's quite universal, but maybe we'll talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Shelby mentioned, we're going to be talking about those common misconceptions or myths that you hear. I know sometimes we do these kinds of episodes and they're a lot of fun because it's amazing what people talk about and how stories change as you start bringing up this fascinating organ of the brain. And there's a number of them. So, and for anyone listening and watching, please, drop in the chat as you're thinking of questions and things to explore as well. So I'm just going to start throwing some out to you. Hearing what your thoughts are. One that we often talk about is just the idea that we only use 10% of our brain. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you like the 3-second soundbite answer, and the answer is no, not true. Or the like 3-day answer to that, actually explaining what we really do. I'll try and give you the 2-minute answer. But it's so far wrong. But what it comes from is this, this observation, ever since humans have been observing anything, this observation that there's a lot going on under the surface, and, all you have to do is learn to drive and notice that you can drive without paying attention to it, right? And that you can be mentally elsewhere, thinking about your day, and you're still driving safely. Like, wow, that's amazing. My brain does all this stuff unconsciously, right? Well, it turns out there's huge amounts happening unconsciously. And in fact, the ratio between that and kind of what you think about consciously is enormous. It's an enormous difference. It's not 10%, it's not 1%, it's not 0.001%. It's hundreds of zeros, 1%. And consciously, you've got this very limited capacity to hold information in mind at one time, right? A very, very limited capacity. But unconsciously, you've got this incredible processing power. You've got something like 100 billion neurons. They've each got 10,000 synapses, but each one of those have like 50 different neurochemicals that can be at 50 different levels at every synapse, every connection. It's crazy. So, I mean, it's literally, there are more ways that a brain can be connected than there are atoms in the known universe, which is a crazy, crazy number. But if you just look at an individual and how much can be processed, like sort of calculations, think of it in terms of calculations, right? How many calculations per second in the part of the brain that you're not consciously accessing, right? That's managing, breathing and sitting up straight and digesting and calcium levels and, like actually hundreds of different things, right? The amount of calculations per second that's going on in there versus the calculations per second in the conscious brain, it's basically about a cubic foot to the Milky Way. It's crazy different. So 10% is like way off, right? But it's it's noticing that there's a lot going on at the surface. And I think, one of the really important realizations is just how much is going on at the surface. That doesn't mean we're completely, from my perspective anyway, it doesn't mean we have completely no free will. We're like a caretaker. Consciousness is like a caretaker that can trim and alter and actually change through choices that underpinning those underpinning processes to a degree. But we are very, very kind of I won't say mechanical, but we're biomechanical. It's a huge amount of what we do is beneath conscious awareness, but conscious awareness still has an important role. So yeah, not 10%, not 1%, not even 21 to 0 is 1%. Way, way, way bigger than that.
Yeah. Oh, I love this discussion. And you're right. We could probably have a whole episode just on this, but this idea that all of this underlying activity is impacting the conscious thought as well. And there was actually a recent study by Nature that showed that everything that's going on unconsciously is impacting our decisions consciously. So even if you were to say, oh, only 2% is being used for our decisions, that's dependent on everything going on in the background as well. So all of that stuff, and we talk about this too when we talk about insights, is all of that unconscious activity that's happening in the seconds before we have an insight. It causes the insight and leads to the insight. So it's necessary.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole thing, on insight, but essentially, your conscious problem solving capacity is really, really quite limited. And you really need unconscious problem solving, and that requires a more quiet brain. And so we've got to leave space for that unconscious problem solving in our lives, much, much more.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is kind of related to it as well. But how many items can you hold in your prefrontal at any one time? There's this magic number 7 that gets thrown around all the time.
Yeah, this was kind of made up around when telephone numbers came up. It's like, you can remember 7 numbers, and people noticed they could remember a phone number at 7 digits. It became harder at 8 or 9. But actually, you could remember lots of strings of digits if you like tie them together, like 53, 47, 29, 82. You can suddenly you can remember. And the reason that's easier is you're chunking, right, which is a clue to how to maximize working memory, right? When you chunk things, right, you can get more out of working memory. But the whole first part of my last book, recent book, Your Brain at Work, is about the limited capacity we have to just make decisions and solve problems, right? The limited capacity, and then how to work around that. So sort of like, it sounds like a downer at first, like learn what your limits are, but then by knowing your limits, you work around them. And it turns out the limits are it's sort of complicated to explain. It's not so much 7. It's actually about a 3-second rule. In other words, something that you can say to yourself in about 3 seconds in your mind's voice, like your mind's eye, your mind's voice. If you can say something to yourself in about 3 seconds, it's in a chunk size that doesn't take too much effort for working memory. But essentially, in terms of numbers of chunks, and this is really well established now, and it's in everyone's experience that's kind of paid attention to this. It's really 3 chunks. In any category, you can remember 3 chunks of ideas and hold them in mind strongly enough to be able to like order them or compare them, right? Mm-hmm. And this is, what do you do with information when you're looking at it? You're like prioritizing it, you're comparing it, what's better, what's worse, what's different, what's the same. They sound a lot like mathematical functions. They kind of are, right? But you can hold 3 chunks and do that effectively. Now, 2 chunks even better, of course, and 1 chunk even better. But in terms of multiple chunks, you start getting to 4 different chunks of ideas in mind. And actually, you start using so much memory to hold them that you can't do the calculations between them. And your calculations between them starts to really degrade, and you keep forgetting one, right? Whereas with 3, you can hold 3, as long as each chunk isn't too big, you can hold 3 chunks and do calculations between them, right? And this is an important point. There's a whole body of study around cognitive constraints, right? It's such a fascinating area. And we've been digging into it in the last few years, looking at this from the perspective of capacity issues and studying cognitive capacity. It's a word we love. And I think the more you understand capacity, the more you can work within it in the way you design presentations or emails or just about everything. You want to work within capacity limits. So 3 is not just a magic number because it feels right. 3 is the number that most humans' brains can hold in any category and still do important calculations between them without so much memory required or effort required that degrades. If that makes sense. Whereas 4 or 5 in any category, basically you just, all your effort goes into storing them. And the best thing you can do actually is not store them, honestly, is like put them on a page or on a flip chart or a whiteboard or whatever, and look at the relationship between things. But even then, 3 is going to be better. But use your brain to process, not store. But even then, try to like break into 3s, and it's just it's more fluent for the brain in every way you can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of externalizing is critical here. So if it's not something that you feel like you actually need to hold on in memory, then just put it on the outside, externalize it.
Yeah, externalizing is the word that we use.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And the other idea is just that you can work with the idea of our capacity. If there are 3 items, you can link them to other things that's already stored in your long-term memory. That'll help you kind of pull up all the other details that are associated with it. There's just one little trigger. It'll help you remember all of it and then easily work with it. And then kind of, just manipulate those important pieces.
Yeah. There's a good question in there about left brain, right brain. I'm happy to, dig into that. We can you can throw your sort of interesting questions coming in. We'll try and cover some. We've got quite a few I think we were thinking of before, but left brain, right brain's a common one. And a lot of these misconceptions come from just sort of obvious answers to commonly observed phenomena, right? So there's certainly a commonly observed phenomena that some people are like really detailed, right? You give them a project and they ask very detailed questions. And there's a thing called construal, right? Construal is essentially the level of abstraction. The famous story about construal is, the janitor at NASA, when someone asks what he's doing, he said he's putting man on the moon, right? He's cleaning the floor, but really it's all about putting man on the moon, right? That's very high construal. Low construal would be I'm moving my hands. That's very low construal for a janitor's job. I'm moving my hands back and forward, right? A sort of an average construal might be I'm keeping the floors clean, right? But a higher construal might be I'm helping making everyone feel good about their environment, right? And then the highest construal is putting man on the moon, right? Or evolving humanity, right? I'm helping evolve humanity even higher. Anyway, you can go up and down that all the time. But people tend to naturally sort of live at different construal levels. And some people are very, very detail oriented, very concrete in their thinking, right? And you'll say, hey, I'm having trouble with this project. And they'll say, all right, let's dig into the details. Tell me everything. Like, show me your spreadsheet, right? And other people will say, oh, hey, what's your goal here? What are you trying to achieve? They'll lift up, right? And so there are big picture thinkers and there are concrete thinkers, right? And people have noticed this and said, oh, this is left brain, right brain, right? Some people are like big picture, more, and that tends to be more creative. The big picture stuff tends to be more creative. The more concrete tends to be more kind of a little bit more problem focused, a little bit more threat focused, but you're also analyzing problems. And so we've noticed this and said, oh, it must be 2 parts of the brain. What's been confusing is the brain does have 2 halves. And at the same time, it's not like everything happens in one half or another. Really, everything happens, everywhere. But what's also made it confusing is that there is a left and right dominance of the prefrontal. But it turns out that has some connections to like which hand you use as a dominant hand. If you're right-handed, it has some things. So it's a very complicated, situation. What we know is people naturally process the world really, really differently. And not just in terms of level of construal, but, in approach versus avoidance. Some people are very positively oriented, some people are very negatively oriented. There's all sorts of different axes in which, and it can't be simplified to left and right brained. Absolutely not. But I think it's an interesting one that comes up a lot just because we notice people think differently to us. So it's very salient for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are skills that are a bit more left or right dominant. So like language, for instance, and that's a classic one. Language is a bit more housed on the left side, but from all of the work that's been done and all of the maybe disorders on left or right side, what they found is in general, it's just a wash across both. Same thing with male, female, and like gender differences. There also are very few gender differences in the brain as well. So those kinds of things become kind of over time a wash from some initial claim. but
Yeah, yeah. If we want to make the chat explode and basically get myself cancelled, we can talk gender differences for a minute. But
yeah, that was the only thing I'll say.
I'll say one thing that there's so much kind of conflicting research on the brain and gender difference, and it's really hard to know what's what's culture and what's genetics and what's all sorts of things. Very hard to know. But we do know that on average there's more this is an average, averages lie, but on average, there's more activity per second in a female brain than a male brain. So literally just more connections being made. But like what that means, who knows, right? Does that mean that women are paying more attention and being more thoughtful? Or does it mean the male brain is more efficient? It's impossible to know. But there's generally more activity per unit of time in the female than the male brain. That's about the only thing you can kind of really take to the bank in the research.
Valerie.
Yeah, let's move on.
All right, so let's move on to something we love talking about, which is habit formation. We're great at doing it, or great at talking about it, and numbers of days that it takes to form habits thrown around all over the place. So sometimes people say it takes 30 days to change a habit. What would you say to that?
It's really interesting how pervasive that one is, right? And what people don't realize is that we actually create new habits many, many times a day and don't notice it. And that there are basically new habits, and that the brain is exceptionally efficient at creating new habits. We do it really quickly, sometimes hundreds of times a day. It's not that hard to maintain them, just a little bit of attention, right? The challenge is when you've got sort of an old habit that's quite dominant, you're trying to create a new one that's almost the same, and your brain can't work out which one to go with. But if you create a really different habit that solves the same problem and focus on the new habit, it's really quite easy. Let me give you an example. This happens to me all the time. Go to a new hotel, never been there before. You don't know the map of it. You don't know the first time, literally just how to get to the elevators from the front desk, right? You do that once. The next time you go, through the front doors, you automatically go to the elevators, right? You've got a habit, a visual map of where the elevators are. You go up to your room, maybe the first time, maybe the second time you have to read the sign. By the time you've gone, twice to your room, you can do it while you're on the phone and not pay attention, right? Maybe the third time. So you've built a habit without really trying, without paying attention. You've layered down a habit. We do it even faster. We meet a new person at a conference. We see their name tag. It's an unusual name. We pronounce the name in our mind's voice incorrectly, and we sort of mispronounce their name. And now we can't undo that. They tell us their name, and all we've done is pronounced it a couple of times in our head, right, badly. So we're actually very, very quick to create new habits. The trouble is in a domain where you've got, you've got one habit, you're trying to create a different one. If it's too similar to the first one, you'll just keep defaulting. Like if you're trying to lose weight, for example, eat less. And you've got a habit of like eating all your food on your plate, and you try to create a new habit of eating 2/3 of the food on your plate. It's too close to the first one, right? It's like create a new habit of breaking a meal into 3 parts, and watching stand-up comedy between each one, right? Like something completely different that gets to the result. And you're not going to default back to the first thing. And I just made that one up, but it's creating new habits that achieve the result that are a little bit further away from the original one, because new habits are pretty easy to create.
Yeah, it's true. And how you reinforce them too, whether if it's a difficult one, making sure there's some kind of social component to it, somebody holding you accountable to it, or you develop some kind of implementation intention if it's a difficult one. If there's a reason that you need to change this, and it's the reinforcement is well developed enough, it's easier to change.
Yeah. And we just need a little bit of attention on that new one. We just need a little bit of focus on that new one. I've been there's such a huge power in daily practice, but what people don't realize is that daily practice can be like 15 seconds, right? Like it's just the smallest amount of attention to a habit, but every day, and it primes you, right, to keep this kind of top of mind. I've been working on my fitness and my strength. I've been like wanting to really work on that. I've been working on it for about I guess about 6 months now. And I hate the idea of going to the gym and like feeling pain, like feel like I've hurt myself for days, right? People are like, oh no, you want to go to the gym and feel like you've really hurt yourself. And then that's how you build. But then I'm addicted to the gym. I don't want to have to be addicted to something. I travel too much to be able to be dependable. So I've been working on like, how do I just observe my limits and just push them slightly in something I can do anywhere, anytime, right? And so it's just push-ups and sit-ups. And, I went from, like 10, from basically 20, 30 a day to now about 150 a day. And, but it's very, very gradually and a little bit more every day, or even just the same amount every day for a week, and then a little bit more the next week and a little bit more. But the thing about every single day, a slight change, or just the habit every single day, even for a moment. I work out for like 5 minutes a day, right? My body's completely changed. 5 to 10 minutes. It's probably 5 minutes total actual exercise in a day. And I can do it while I'm, on calls or do anything. So it's like, how do you get it regular is the question with habits. It's not about like, and people miss that. It's get it regular, get it easy, right? Link it into existing systems. That's how we build habits more so than, less than 30 days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they talk about, starting to go to the gym, putting your clothes out the night before, so you don't really have an excuse, and like you have that, and it's already in the way that you're working. It's on the way to work or whatever it is, because it's too easy to diverge if it's a difficult habit to build.
Yeah, so the Cliff Note, and there's a lot of good books on this. Atomic Habits is good, but just make it daily, make it easy, link it to existing things. Those are the 3 general rules, and then you'll be able to to build those habits. But it's not 30 days. You'll start to build it really quickly, like 2 or 3 days. You'll really start to get a habit, or even one day, a couple of attempts at something starts to build a habit. So have faith about new habits. Just make them different to current habits.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you're changing that habit, do you really truly need to understand the habit you're trying to dislodge to do it? Or
this is a really contentious one, and this is a really complicated answer and a contentious one, because the entire field of therapy and psychotherapy, and to a degree psychiatry and many other fields are basing their insights on if you understand something, you'll be able to change it, right? And then there's a whole other philosophical approaches like brief solutions focused therapy and all sorts of other approaches that say, look, let's just focus on creating new habits. And to some degree it depends on the kind of domain we're talking about, but generally we tend to default to wanting to understand everything about a habit to be able to change it. But you got to remember, it's an attention economy in the brain, and where we focus attention, we either create or deepen the networks, right? So the more attention we give to something, the more we're priming it in our brain, right? So in a lot of ways, what we want to do is take attention away from habits that we don't like, right? And put attention on new habits. Now, certainly there are some issues in life where we'll need to understand them, but that tends to be the default. 100% of the time, we want to change something about ourselves, we go straight to let's understand it more, let's dig right in. And I think that's only relevant, maybe half the time. And I think maybe half the time we should just focus on building new habits and stop kind of giving more attention to things. So it's not an either or, it's more of like getting some distinction about when to do which one.
Yeah, it's true. And there is research showing that when you're trying to change a habit, if you're always thinking about that other habit, that actually gets in the way. And so if you're trying to understand that habit you're trying to lose, you're always thinking about it as you're thinking about the new habit, and that just conflicts with the whole idea of changing it.
Yeah. It's a lot about priming, and this goes to a question that was in the chat earlier. There's a couple of things to understand about the brain. It is true at about 7 years, you've got just like a completely new everything in your body, like new cells. You're a completely new person in about 7 years, not just the brain, new cells everywhere. But at the same time, it's really important to understand that the brain is like, and this is going to freak some people out, but it's the texture of thick custard, right? That sort of just holds together. And it's also, it's dark and quiet in there. It's electrical signals making meaning. And it's the best metaphor is like a very dense forest, very, very dense forest that's actually constantly moving and is actually massively influenced by the light and the temperature, just like a forest. The light, the temperature, this, who you're sitting around, everything you're doing, what you're wearing, like it's constantly changing. And it turns out like the neurons that you use to, pick up your glasses today are not the neurons you'll use to pick up your glasses in a week. That actually it's constantly moving. Now, obviously, a lot of things stay somewhat consistent, but at a deep level, there's constant movement. And this is why, like, you can be a native English speaker and speak, absolutely perfect English, and go to Italy for a month and try to speak Italian and come back and your English is weird. Like, how does that happen, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's like, because you're constantly being primed by whatever's new, and this is changing the architecture. So it's like a forest, and small primes make a big difference. Priming is like nudging you to try new things. So this is good news and bad news. But the good news is you can continue to change yourself. The bad news is we're massively influenced by lots of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the plasticity and the new connections that are formed and taken away. So this kind of leads back to the habit idea too. If you're not also practicing your habits, those connections can weaken as well. So think about all of those things you're weakening, you're strengthening, all of these different mental maps are changing all of the time. So your experiences throughout your life are highly impactful. So it's good for the idea that we can learn things throughout our life, which is great, right? But also that, an experience will have an impact on your brain.
Yeah. One of the myths I hear a lot is, you can only learn things till you're about a teenager, or, your brain stops learning at 25, or this kind of thing. And, neuroplasticity is amazing when you're young, and then basically goes. And neuroplasticity is just the, brain's ability to adapt, is there your whole life. You can learn a language in your 90s. What happens is you just don't tend to want to. You tend to not sort of be bothered by new things. That's the research. But you absolutely can learn a new instrument, new language, anything, well into your, 70s, 80s, 90s. And lots of people do, and they tend to live longer, those people, because it's keeping your brain healthier in all sorts of ways. But the sort of motivation to do it is a little bit less. The capacity is very much there. But there are obviously periods of development, periods of increased plasticity. In the womb is one. You learn the phonemes, the units of sounds, in the womb. Obviously, the first few years, you can learn languages, 2, 3, 4, 5 languages just intuitively. There's periods of plasticity, and there's a period of plasticity that ends around mid-20s, where they say your brain is fully formed, but really it's continuing to form and grow. And I think the important understanding there is that you can evolve your brain at any point in your life. You can change it, in some meaningful way at any point. The key is the motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that we actually get better at as we age is our ability to learn new emotional regulation strategies. And emotion is something that we often talk about and misconstrue a bit as well. So one of the things that people talk about is this idea that we can either express or suppress your emotions. It's either one or the other. And we talk about something a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. This is like one of those, what I call level 5 insights people have in their life that sort of changes their whole life. And some people have this in their teens, some have it in their 20s, some don't have it till they're much older. But a lot of people are sort of stuck in this mental model that either, when they feel something, they can either let it out or try not to let it out, right? And that a lot of people are like quite literal with emotions. Like, you feel something, you have to express it. They experiment with that, and they discover that expressing emotions, makes other people upset, leaves, anger and upset and fear in other people's experience, and leaves a trace in you. So they go, all right, let's push down our emotions. Let's try not to feel them. And, you look around an average workplace, you got large numbers of people just pushing down emotions, right? Trying not to feel them. And the challenge with this is that to some degree, that's true after an emotion kicks in. And one of the most fantastic scientists in this space, who's really the founding father of emotional regulation research, is James Gross. And he's one of my heroes. He started studying emotions in a completely different way than anyone had. And he basically studied them over time and found that there's this really big difference between before an emotion kicks in and after it kicks in, right? And we understand that through, like, emotions pull away resources from prefrontal, which limit your choices, because that's where executive control is. But he looked at it, and he found that, before an emotion kicks in, you have a certain number of choices. Once it kicks in, those choices become more limited. It becomes harder to execute things. And so we should put a lot of effort in kind of the before the emotion strategy, which is, I won't get into the technicals, but a lot of people are stuck in this belief that, you either feel it or you push it down. And the reality is there's this whole other path of essentially interacting with the emotions. And, one of those things is to like label them, is to just kind of describe them simply, which turns them down. And another is to literally alter the interpretation at the source of the emotion, right? Which is called reappraisal. But some, when people have this insight, it can be profound. Like, oh, wow, I can change how I see things and therefore change how I feel about them. Like people are blown away when they first realize that. It's quite life-changing. And, you can be in a classroom as a teenager and, start to get upset with something the teacher said and then realize, no, I can actually change my interpretation and realize that they're just trying to help here. And they really are trying to help, and now I can calm down a bit. But so people notice this. It's really interesting. So people go two ways. Some people like kind of go this like, oh no, that's wrong. I shouldn't like reinterpret the world. I should deal with reality. I should grin and bear it and like deal with reality as it is. And it's wrong to like change how I perceive things. I shouldn't look at lots of perspectives. I should just see the perspective I see. Has more integrity. It's more authentic to see what I see. The trouble with that is you die younger, you have worse health, and you happen to see things based on all your past experiences, many of which are random, and your genetics. And actually, there are infinite ways of seeing every situation. And there's a scale. You can look at a situation and see it in a way that makes you more anxious. And generally, that's not adaptive. Some situations it is. You can look at a situation and see it in a way that's more positive. And there's plenty of situations where that's actually more adaptive and some where it's not, right? But you have this ability to change your interpretation of an event, right? It's, someone cuts you off in traffic. You can decide that the world hates you, right? And it's not going to be a good day for you. You can decide that someone else is having a rough day, and this is a chance to actually make their day better by being really kind back, right? And confusing them, right? And so these are different interpretations. And the people who are sort of stuck in like, no, this is, I feel like this is an awful person. This is how it is. I'm not. Those people tend to suffer more depression. They tend to have worse health, and they're often quite concrete thinkers and struggle with abstract thinking as well. So the people who reappraise, it's called reappraisal. The people who reappraise too much sometimes also have different kinds of mental health challenges. But there's a certain amount of reappraisal that seems to be healthy. Now, James studied this, and he actually did this amazing study that's not talked about enough. He got two large groups of people and categorized them into which of those strategies they had. When a strong threat came along, they basically, would grin and bear it, or they would reappraise. And it was a complicated study. There's a whole paper on it. I write about it in Your Brain at Work. But the basic study was like two groups of people. What do you do when a strong emotion comes along? Do you just experience it, or do you alter your interpretations, right? And what he found was that the people who altered their interpretations were just massively above average on pretty much everything that counts, right? Quality of relationships, quality of physical health, quality of mental health, just everything. And the people who did it the other way were significantly below average. And the gap between these two was enormous. It was, a really challenging life versus a really healthy life, taking into account circumstances. And just this one variable. So it's a really important thing to understand. And I think, one of the interesting things about understanding your brain is it gives you more ways to reappraise. Wasn't that a fun rhyme? More ways to reappraise. It's like, oh, that's a status threat. That's not the person hating me. That's just a status threat that's being created. Or, oh, that's my pain center kicking off. And I don't have to add the distressing component. I can just look at the data and that'll turn it down. And so the more you understand about the brain, the more you can reappraise in real time and alter your own interpretations, which is really, really cool. So, sorry, long answer, but it's James Gross. He's really the founding father of emotional regulation research. We've had him at the summit a few times. We'll see if we can dig up the video of him, if my team can dig that up in time. I don't know if we can, but yeah, amazing presenter. Actually, one of the things I love about James, sorry, it's an aside, but he's very quiet and very like sciencey and unassuming and like slow and deliberate. And he gets on stage and he's a completely different persona, like stand-up comedian and amazing high energy. It's like I just didn't see that coming. I guess he reappraises.
He probably does. He probably reappraises before he goes on stage. But the amazing thing about reappraisal is you can also do it at any point even years after you had an experience. And one of the amazing things about memory is that when you pull up a memory, so maybe a bad memory that had a bad emotional component to it, you can pull it up and you can act to reappraise it, and it can change. It's vulnerable at that time, the memory is. You can change your memory a bit as well, which is incredibly powerful for us to have.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can reappraise in the past memories that are causing problems. It's an interesting question from Eric. We've been thinking about sort of the different tools you can use at different levels of emotions, and we categorize threats into 3 levels. Level 1 is kind of alert but not alarmed. It's being focused but not anxious. Level 2 is quite, is very alert and a little alarmed, and it's sort of frazzled. And level 3 is the amygdala hijack. It's the overwhelming threat. And so, at level 1, you can label, you can like put words on what you're feeling and it'll turn down the emotions. At level 2, you need reappraisal. And that's because labeling won't do it. So level 2 threats, you want to really identify the interpretation you've made and change it. Level 3, you might not have enough oxygen and glucose in your brain's braking system, which is part of the prefrontal. You might not have enough of that to actually be able to reappraise, right? You just kind of brains on fire. And what you might need is a biological intervention at that stage, which is a complex word for a nap, a meal, a workout, exercise. Sometimes you just like that frazzled, you just literally need to like a meal or a cup of tea and then a nap, and then you come back and you're fine. So there's level 3 threats, which is that amygdala hijack. In that situation, you often need a biological intervention to calm the nervous system down enough to be able to reappraise, bring it down to a level 2.
Yeah. And what else is coming up for me is a lot of times we have these emotions in the workplace, in social interactions. And that's where we have this experience bias that comes in often, is that we just think that we see the world in a certain way, and we think we interpret others' intentions in a certain way, and we're often wrong about them and why. And these intentions might not have been directed at me; they might have just been having a bad day. So these kinds of emotional regulation strategies are critical. Walking away, reappraising this. Oh, this person just had a bad day. They weren't cutting me off because they didn't like me when they saw me, or whatever it was. And that can help all of our interactions as well.
Yeah, for leadership, if you can't reappraise like easily, often, regularly, you're going to struggle as a leader because you have really strong emotions to deal with all the time. Excuse me, as a manager all the way up, basically the intensity of the emotions that you have to deal with gets stronger and stronger and stronger as you go up the organization. So the Peter principle might be, you get promoted to the level of your self-regulation capacity. Because as you lose the ability to manage strong emotions, you lose the ability to make good decisions and be insightful. And so you need to be able to stay cool under pressure at different levels. And emotions definitely rise as you go up the organization because of the complexity of problems, the implications of problems, the number of people watching you, all of these things kind of combine to make it very stressful as you go up organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no way to escape that. In all of our workplaces, we're interacting with individuals. There will always be emotions involved. So working in these emotional regulation strategies and having multiple tools, different kinds to use at different times, is critical to kind of pick out. But yeah, so let's make a little bit of a switch to something else we talk a lot about, which is learning, and how best to do it and design it. And we did have some people ask about learning strategies and learning design. So one idea is that we should just throw everything at people in one block. And everyone who follows us knows that isn't true. But can you talk to that a bit?
Yeah. So I've been doing this event called a Leadership Development Mini Summit, a half-day experience with like 50 to 100 chief human resource officers and heads of talent, heads of leadership development. But like 50 to 100 in New York and London and Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and LA, and all sorts of places. And it's been fascinating to do it. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about is the AGES model, which is it's the framework for thinking about learning design and instructional design and facilitation, all of it. And it's essentially the 4 necessary foundations for easy recall under pressure, which is a measure of learning that we think is important. Easy recall under pressure is the outcome you want for learning these days with leadership skills in particular. And so how do you get there? You need strong attention, strong generation, strong emotions, strong spacing. The ones people get wrong are the emotions and the spacing. And you actually want pretty strong emotions for people to remember things. You don't just want people comfortable the whole time. You want them comfortable at the start and then really challenged and then excited at the end. You want actually a bit of a roller coaster for memories to really form. But the spacing one is one that people get wrong as well, because intuitively, again, this is going back to that sort of the intuitions we have sometimes being wrong. Intuitively, we think learning in one block is better. It turns out it is actually true if you're only needing short-term memory. So if you're needing to remember something for a few days for an exam, learning it all in a block just before is great for short-term memory. You won't remember it in a month. If you're wanting to remember something for months or years, you want to spread out that, space out that learning. But it's not intuitive. People predict it'll be better to do a 1-day class than 4 one-hour classes or 8 one-hour classes. People are like, oh no, I'm going to learn much more if I learn it in a day and just kind of see how it all fits and get my head around it in a day. If I split it up, I'm going to lose the thread. It's not going to work. But we don't store memories, we grow them. And the effort of attention in different contexts is a big part of that. So those are some of the myths that I think people get wrong about sort of learning and learning design. So there's this really huge sort of free bonus that you get from spreading out learning over time, even when you're not taking into account the sort of accountability factor, which can increase about 7 times the number of actions people take when you spread out learning. But even without that, it just makes things stick much easier just by spreading it out. So those are the sort of 2 areas I think that we have myths in. And, people have to feel comfortable, and people learn better in a block or in person.
Yeah, right. And there are some very clear underlying neural support for this as well. And we talk about this with the spacing idea, is that there needs to be time for consolidation to happen. And that can only happen when you're not in the learning environment. And it's like a process that your hippocampus has to go under. It happens a lot when we sleep as well. So that's why it's good to incorporate sleep in the middle of those as well. So the benefit that you'll get, the return on investment for those learning experiences is much higher if you just incorporate some spaces. And it might take 3 days instead of 1 day, but you'll get this long-term learning. You don't have to do it again for them.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're coming close to the end. I mean, I'd love to hear a bit about what you had kind of learned through your mini summits. We kind of touched on them here a little bit, but what about the skill learning that you've kind of covered along the way?
Yeah, there were a couple of things really jumped out. It's so interesting doing the same event in different countries and different contexts, and you sort of see what's really human versus what's, say, American or something, right? You see what's everyone struggling with. And I was really amazed at just how consistent the challenges are around leadership everywhere in the world, or everywhere I went. Didn't go to every country, but everywhere I went, the challenges were very, very consistent. Everyone everywhere is dealing with, overwhelmed employees, the fears and challenges and opportunities of AI, the sort of divided workplaces happening everywhere, strangely enough. A bunch of things just very, very consistent like this. But one of the insights that really was very powerful for me, and I think for others, was we were looking at like leadership development from a brain perspective, obviously, right? And when you look at okay, so leaders have to be better at, say, managing emotions, right? You look at the actual brain skills, the cognitive skills involved. Learning those when you first become a manager is really, really important. I mean, learning those even as an individual contributor is important. But when you first become a manager, the level of threat you experience goes up a lot, right? Suddenly you've got people counting on you, you've got more uncertainty, you've got less autonomy, you've got more people watching you. So, some more status threats. So you first become a manager, just like your threat level goes way up. And so you need to learn, often people need to learn better self-regulation strategies at that point. But then you become a middle manager, it jumps again, right? Suddenly you have even more people watching you, greater status threat, more uncertainty, less autonomy, maybe some unfairness now. And so as you go up, you get these big bumps in the sort of cognitive challenges. It's not just threat, it's also the amount you have to process. So the way you move through information has to improve, right? The need for insights, goes up. So all these cognitive skills basically become more important and also more complex to execute, right? It's more challenging to have insights as you go up. So the insights become more important and more challenging, right? Emotional regulation becomes more important and more challenging. And what's interesting is that we were looking at leadership programs and all these, like you have a company of 10,000 employees with 1,000 managers, right? Those 1,000 managers, the company will put 700 of them in a frontline leader program. They learn a bunch of stuff, and then they'll put 200 in a completely different program for middle managers. Then they'll put, the top 100 in a completely different program at a business school. And what happens is there's no consistent flow. And one of the big misconceptions is that you need different kind of leadership programs for different levels of leader in an organization. And we think that that's completely done a disservice to the whole industry, because when you look at the human skills, which are only going to become more important, not less important. When you look at the human skills, there's a friend there. He comes up when I say human skills. Okay, when you look at the human skills involved, they actually are the same, but harder and in more challenging contexts. So really what we should be doing is teaching first-time leaders, basics about the brain and self-regulation and all this stuff, and then coming back to it in different contexts and coming back to it in different contexts. Now, of course, a frontline employee doesn't need to know how to, run a P&L the way a senior executive does. There are some technical skills that are different, but the core is the same. And so I'm a bit of a rant here, but it was really fascinating to see just how everyone agreed with that, and how it's completely not the state of leadership development right now. And so I think leadership development needs to be about let's really get good at the core, brain skills of leadership. And let's keep coming back to them and back to them and back to them at different levels of leader. And, we've been thinking about ways to do this with, a core learning experience, and then, adding things to it. So we've been solving for that. But that's probably one of the biggest insights that everyone really resonated with.
Yeah. And development in general of leaders should continue. So even if they think they're, highly experienced, they have to continue to and practice all of those skills along the way. And it doesn't necessarily change by area of the world either.
Yeah. Very consistent. People had the same challenges everywhere in the world, which was kind of spooky, scary, and wonderful all at once.
Yeah. No, a great question by Abraham. Do you think how critical is the role of developing emotional intelligence at various levels? And you kind of spoke to this a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how there's different language for the exact same thing. So, and there's no one right language, but we think of we think of these as cognitive skills. So the ability to manage limited capacity, the ability to manage emotions, the ability to manage social interactions, to keep others in a toward state. You could call those EI, you could call those social skills, you could call them social emotional skills. They have lots of different words, leadership skills. What I find is that using the language of the brain is really helpful, because you can actually show studies and show concrete, examples and what's really going on in the brain. And so for really rational thinkers, which are sort of most leaders, it's really helpful not to talk about emotional intelligence. I find we rarely use those words. We talk about, let's get in and understand the brain. It's just you get less resistance in that way. But ultimately, it's the same kind of cognitive skills that we're all trying to work on. And I could show you 100 different leadership programs and show you exactly the cognitive skills that every single one of those is working on. And they're the exact same cognitive skills, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone is teaching reappraisal somewhere, but in different language. Everyone is teaching managing limited capacity in some way. Well, not everyone, but as an example. So we just like to kind of get down to the source and then be able to explain it in terms of the brain. And it opens people's minds talking about the brain, ironically.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it gives a huge why to everything, which is really important for us to understand. The reason it's important to understand the brain is it makes us work better together. And with
really interesting. I really want to do this study, and maybe Emma will talk about this some more in our research team. But I've wanted to do this study for forever about. I've noticed in myself and others that learning about the brain makes you more mindful. Learning about your brain increases mindfulness, and mindfulness is you think of it as not mindless, right? So you're paying attention. The technical definition is you're paying attention in the present in an open way. And from John Kabat-Zinn and others, that's kind of the general sort of layperson's definition: paying attention in the present in an open way. And what happens is the more language you have for your brain, the more things you can observe in real time to pay attention to, and it actually helps you see things and switch, make different choices, which is what mindfulness does as well. And so mindfulness practice around your breath or whatever you're doing, mindfulness practice has all these amazing benefits. But I think the more you know about your brain, the easier it is to be mindful, and you get kind of similar benefits to it. So I think I want to design a study where we get a control group, we teach them mindfulness, and another group teach them about the brain and see similarities, and a third group teach them nothing and see similarities and differences in brain functioning afterwards, to see what's going on. Let's have some fun with that in the next year.
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. I mean, I know this actually reminds me of somewhat of a study that we're thinking of doing in the next year, right? With the some exploration of CEOs and their brains.
Oh, yeah. Good. Thanks for the reminder. And thanks,
Yeah.
Amy, for being the first volunteer. That's amazing. Look, we've got volunteers already.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've been I've been thinking about this for years, and we're just soft launching sort of this is like a first launch of an idea that we've had for a while. And we basically designed a CEO retreat, a CEO brain retreat. We're doing it in partnership with one of the professors at Columbia University. His name's Moran Cerf. It's not officially with Columbia, but it's with this professor at Columbia. And he's got an amazing lab. And essentially, where this came from is I've been doing a lot more sessions with CEOs in the last couple of years, and like spending half a day with like many groups of CEOs. And one of the questions I keep getting asked, sort of quietly, is, is my brain okay? How do I know my brain's okay? And what, and so we've been thinking about this for a while, and so we're launching this experience. We're calling it a CEO Brain Lab, and it's a 4-day on-site experience in New York City in the spring. So we'll launch it in the spring next year. But you can just quietly plant the seed in your CEO's ear, if you like. But essentially, it's a 4-day experience of actually assessing your brain, but also assessing it in the context of leadership. So imagine like being wired up and doing leadership activities like giving feedback, receiving feedback, trying to influence others, trying to do a presentation with a group of other CEOs, and everyone seeing what their brain's doing, and studying the synchrony and asynchrony and all this stuff. So it's not just assessing your brain, it's assessing your brain and assessing your brain as you do leadership tasks and learning all this like foundational stuff. So we'll pepper in a lot about the core analyze skills, but also real-time assessment. So we're excited about that. It'll be a great experiment ground. If you're interested in hearing more about that, just put your company name and CEO Brain Lab in the chat. That's a lot of words, and someone will reach out to you and send more information. If it might not be for you, it might be for your CEO, but we'll just put your company name and CEO Brain Lab in there in the chat. We'll reach out, and I think we put a link. It's very early. It's the first sort of announcement about it. The other cool thing that we're doing, which may be more relevant to this community, is we're going to run a CHRO summit specifically for CHROs in the winter next year, and this is going to be late February, early March, actually in the snow in Park City, in a hotel right on the snow. We're doing like a half day in the morning, and then the afternoon's free for networking, also known as skiing, or whatever sport you have. But we're doing like a 3-day Sunday night arrival, and then 3 days with CHROs and one down. So folks in charge of people or one down. So that's you'll see more information about that coming up soon. So the CHRO summit that we're doing in the winter, and then a CEO retreat, a CEO Brain Lab that we're doing in there as well. The other thing we didn't mention that I was talking a lot about on the on tour, if I can use that phrase, is a question that came up a lot in this time. It's been about accountability. I know we've talked about that a little bit on the show, but I wanted to bring that back. So I got to like present our model for accountability out a lot, and the room would always go when we did that. So accountability, one of the big myths about accountability. One of the big myths is that it's sort of a punitive approach. Like, accountability is making sure you fire underperformers. And we realized actually that there's 2 types of accountability. There's punitive accountability, but then there's non-punitive accountability, which is actually about people like taking accountability and owning it, and it's very similar to responsibility. But we've seen this whole different approach to accountability that's about basically like making much clearer promises, like much clearer expectations, and then really managing to those exact expectations, and then really cleaning up if you don't. That's the sort of simple summary. There's a whole fascinating neuroscience of explanation of expectations, but it's about managing to like really set those properly, really meet them, really clean up if you don't. And very rare skill. Most of us have a handful of people who do that, and it really should be everyone in an organization. So we've built a solution called Deliver, and we're now starting to roll that out in Hive format, which is the 3 virtual sessions over 3 weeks. And so Deliver is now starting to go out, and we're getting some great interest in that, and it's teaching those skills over a month. If you're interested in learning more about Deliver, just put the word Deliver and your company name in the chat. Someone will reach out and send you some information, maybe chat more about it. So Deliver and your company name, and we'll share more about that. So those are some kind of cool new things that we've been working on, and some really interesting feedback on that. I see we're coming to the end. Emma, any other closing comments or announcements you wanted to make?
Well, I think the one you forgot was the summit, where people will hear about all of these things. We'll have sessions on accountability, the CEO retreat. We'll talk about, the neural signals in CEOs that Moran will present, all of those things, AI, technology, everything. So that's coming up soon in October, and you'll hear from almost everyone we brought up today, as well as us.
Yeah. So end of October, 29th, 30th of October. And actually we're doing it globally. It's virtual, but the upside of that is we're doing it for every time zone. So there's an EMEA version, a North America version, and an APAC version. And we'll be able to get the exact perfect scientists along involved as well. So try to hold the 29th and 30th in your calendar. But thanks everyone for being here. Great to be back in New York. Thanks, Emma, for great collaboration, and Shelby and everyone behind the scenes. Have a fantastic weekend, a great week. Look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate your time as always. Just stick around for a little bit. We have a poll. If you want to work with us, let us know how we can help you out. As we just mentioned, Summit 2024 is on the way. We're going fully virtual this year, October 29th and 30th. So you can visit summit.neuroleadership.com for all of your needs. If you enjoyed today's session, you might enjoy our Insider Exchange. This is specifically for senior executives, but it is an opportunity to have roundtable discussions with our internal leaders and conversations. So if that's something that interests you, check that out. And also we want to continue to expand and partner with our community. So if you're interested in hosting an event with us, also check out the link, and there's more information on our website too. And lastly, if you enjoyed the episode, you can always listen to it on our podcast along with other episodes, Your Brain at Work, wherever you listen. And for listeners, if you use Your Brain at Work 24, you can get a 10% discount off of Summit tickets. So check that out. And this is where we officially say farewell. So on behalf of our team, we really appreciate you being here every Friday, and we will see you next week. Have a great weekend.